All right, folks, here we go with the news for Chapter 9, talking about TV programming in this chapter and a good portion of this chapter talking about TV news in particular. So let's get underway and start off our discussion with a brief history of television news. A good place to start is by talking about the assassination of President John Kennedy. Assassinations in other nations often led to governmental chaos and public violence, but in the U.S., it turned people to their TV sets for news, for comfort, and most importantly, for explanations. The events surrounding the assassination began the era of television news supremacy. With the coverage of the assassination, TV news seized the public consciousness. No longer was TV news the stepchild of print, or of radio, for that matter. As 1963 drew to a close, both NBC and CBS were telecasting 30 minutes of nightly news with pictures from the field. So what happened with the events surrounding President Kennedy's assassination was that within moments of the event happening, television broke in with special reports, and events very quickly happened afterwards. And it also started a bit of a debate as to whether television news was merely just reporting events that have happened, or if they had a way of shaping the minds of people in the way that they presented the news. The 60s and 70s were marked by violent confrontations, social upheavals, and cultural change. And for the first time in history, it all happened in front of television cameras. There were 3 major events that occurred during this time period, and each event became forever intertwined with the growth of television journalism. You see them on your screen here. There's the civil rights movement of the 60s, there's the Vietnam War, and then there was the events leading to man going to the moon. Let's first talk about the civil rights movement. The ways that the stories were reported on television very much shaped the way that TV was infiltrating itself into the culture and into the way that current events were being told about and distributed to the public. Everything from the integration of schools to Dr. King's famous "I Have a Dream" speech. Also, coverage from the scene of various assemblies of civil disobedience and different protests and riots. Also, it created the exposure that showed the hatred that came from groups like the KKK. Television was able to bring those stories in such a way that made these different events much more real to the people of America as they were viewing the stories from their homes. As far as Vietnam goes, it was not the first war on television. That goes to Korea. The Korean War was the first one to be shown on TV on any sort of a regular basis, but there wasn't the immediacy of the events from Korea as there were with Vietnam, because they didn't quite have the technology in terms of the portability of cameras and being able to instantaneously get content from the scene to the television studio in the way that they did into the 60s and 70s. They just didn't have that available to them in the late 40s into the 50s. The Vietnam War showed TV's ability to bring distant events into America's living room with the different ways that it could do so in a much more immediate fashion. During this period, TV news made virtually all its major advances. So again, we're talking about portable cameras, satellite relay systems, the ability to broadcast in color, replaying of videotape, and so many other things that made the Vietnam conflict much more imminent in terms of its coverage in the United States. Thirdly, the landing on the moon. Beginning with Alan Shepard's spaceflight in 1961, space shots became a major focus on television news, leading up to the lunar landing of Apollo 11. In the summer of 1969, Neil Armstrong set foot on the moon, an event witnessed by the largest global television audience up to that time. It was an estimated 600 million people watching on every continent except Antarctica. And then within minutes of that event happening, President Nixon was on a split screen talking to the astronauts by telephone. And then just a couple hours later, the world was watching the astronauts blasting off from the moon, returning to the Earth. And that showed the power of television to bring events to the home, not just here on terra firma, but even going up into the stratosphere and outer space. Television news winds up becoming big business as a result of all the things that it could do. The major networks wound up expanding their news coverage. One example of the way they did that was through ABC's Nightline broadcast. That show started as a nightly update of what was happening with the Iran hostage situation in 1979 into 1980. And it would come on after the late local news and would cover daily what was going on with this particular issue. And the show stuck around after the Iran hostage crisis was over. Local television news also grew, and for good reason. It had become a profit center for television stations, accounting for as much as 1/3 to 1/2 of all advertising revenues. There's a lot of reasons for that. One of the big ones is that locally produced programs such as the news are completely within the realm of the local television station. They own the content, they produce the content, they can structure the format of the content, which means they can decide how many commercial avails are going to air within the newscast. They can adjust that as necessary. If it's a light news day, if it's a heavy news day, if they have extra commercials to pack in, they can simply restructure the news for that day to allow more commercials to air. And they own all of the commercial inventory, which means they earn all of the advertising revenue for the ads that air. And you're also seeing in our current situation where many stations are expanding how many newscasts that they do. It used to just be a noon, 6 p.m. and 11 p.m. sort of thing that the local stations would do, but now you have morning newscasts, and those have expanded to several hours, starting at 4:30 in the morning. The 6 o'clock news now starts at 5 o'clock, and in some cases 4 o'clock in the afternoon. You have stations that now air 10 o'clock newscasts. Many stations are looking to expand and put new and expanded news coverage onto their airwaves. It serves a public service to the audience, keeping them abreast of current events, and also gives them more control of their on-air programming and advertising availability. TV news growth in the 70s and 80s, a couple of issues that came up here. One was kind of the progression of the way that the news was presented. Up to this point, the news was either a 15-minute or a 30-minute broadcast with men that were rather serious and conservative in the way that they presented the news. But then they decided to add personality and flair to newscasts by bringing on younger and, quite honestly, more attractive men to the television screen, and then also adding women into the mix. And they would also have a certain kind of chemistry with each other, where they would banter with each other about the stories that they told, even sometimes giving a little bit of commentary. And when that happened, TV news was criticized by newspapers mostly for going from information to entertainment and sleaze, where not just in terms of doing that, but also in the types of stories that they would broadcast, where some TV stations were going into much more sensationalized sorts of news reporting. Another big development in the 70s into the 80s was the development of ENG and SNG. ENG standing for Electronic News Gathering. This is where portable video cameras and recorders became commercially available. With ENG, cameras and recorders could go anywhere, so you had a lot more reporters out there in the field grabbing video and sending it back to the station. So events could be recorded in full natural sound. The most important parts could be edited together and done so in a very speedy and cost-efficient manner. SNG stands for Satellite News Gathering. This refers to the use of mobile trucks mounted with satellite communications equipment to report local, national, and international events. SNG trucks and vans could transmit up to communication satellites, and then the pictures and sounds would be gathered by ENG equipment. It was thus possible to obtain live news pictures from pretty much anywhere in the world. And we're seeing SNG kind of evolve as well, where in addition to satellites, we now have internet technology that allows for communication by means of Zoom and Skype and all sorts of other different instant messaging and video chatting platforms. So it is becoming much, much easier for news outlets to be able to report news from where the news is happening and to bring newsmakers in and talk with them from anywhere around the world. Now, at local stations, the competition for audiences was most intense during the periods when the Nielsen Ratings Company conducted surveys of local TV viewing. These periods that they would do that are known as sweeps. And this kind of added to the competition of news, not just in terms of news gathering, but also in news presentation to its local market audiences. In TV, the sweeps periods occur 4 times a year. They're in February, in May, in July, and in November. And what was important about sweeps is that when Nielsen would check out the ratings for stations during those periods, it became a way for television stations to be able to see what their ratings numbers were and to use those numbers as a basis for setting advertising rates for the station. So in a quest for number one status, many local news operations took to programming series of short documentaries. These would be known as mini docs, and when you would see these various mini docs, they would cover subject matter that would try to entice viewers to tune into their station and check it out. You would see a lot of stories focusing on various types of crime, various types of investigative reporting, a lot of consumer type news, and a lot of it on some stations would be more sensational in nature to try to draw people into the newscast. They were accompanied by extensive advertising campaigns on the air and in print, also on billboards and buses. They would pull all the stops and try to get as many people as possible to tune in to their broadcast, especially during sweeps. A number of news consultants emerged to provide expertise required of news managers in this competitive environment. News consultants would help them to structure the news format, the way the news was presented, what kinds of stories should have prominence on the air, how much time to give the various news stories, what sort of personalities to use. All those sorts of things were things that news consultants would advise stations on. Then we get into the all-news environment, the 24-hour cycle. The cable industry began C-SPAN in 1979, and the public service operation provides gavel-to-gavel coverage of congressional hearings, political party conventions, and other public affairs programming. It was designed to be just the raw, unedited happenings of what was going on in Washington, D.C. and throughout the country. And then commercial ventures started taking hold in 1980 with Ted Turner starting CNN. He also started CNN Headline News about 18 months after that. Both services struggled for several years, though, before attaining widespread coverage on cable systems. What really did it for CNN was their coverage of the Persian Gulf War in 1991. Prior to that, CNN was not necessarily seen as a news leader. I mean, it was the first one to go out there and do this sort of thing. And it just was not taken as seriously. So broadcast networks still pretty much ran control of what was going on with news until this happened in 1991. Once others saw CNN's success, others started coming into play, including CNBC in 1991 to cover mostly economic news. Bloomberg coming along about 4 years later, also focusing more on the business and financial world. And then direct competitors to CNN came around in 1996 with the Fox News Channel and with MSNBC. And this demonstrates that news had become an important source of programming for cable providers. Now, as the major 24-hour news channels started becoming more and more prominent, we start to see more and more talk and commentary coming on these various channels with editorial opinion content, a lot of talk show types of content. And that's pretty much how we kind of see the cable news networks by and large today. So this is a good place for us to take a break. We will continue talking about television news, kind of get into what's happening today when you join me over at part B of Chapter 9.